State lawmakers are considering a bill that would allow South Carolina taxpayers to take advantage of the tax breaks in President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill. But with the filing deadline just 3 weeks away, time is running out. Nick Reagan spoke with a tax expert who's proposing a change that could save you a lot of money.
Periodically, the state legislature realigns the state tax code to that of the federal tax code so that you can take advantage of all the same tax breaks in your state returns as you do your federal filings. It's called conformity, and we haven't passed a conformity bill since 2024. Now, since then, President Donald Trump's Big Beautiful Bill introduced some new tax breaks, but those breaks, they haven't been added to the state tax code just yet. Those deductions include popular proposals like no tax on tips or overtime and expanded credits for seniors. CPA and College of Charleston instructor Thomas Spade says most taxpayers would see an additional $45 to $200 in tax reductions, while those over 65 could see a reduction of more than $800 in their taxable income. Now, just 3 weeks from the tax deadline, lawmakers are still trying to get conformity passed, but there's a problem. Many of us have already filed our taxes. That means if conformity does pass, you'll have to submit an amended tax return, something Spade says is difficult and often requires a tax professional.
And the legislature, I'm not sure if they really thought about the cost of filing an amended return when they were considering this, because millions of people that have already done what they were supposed to do would now be out of pocket even more to go back and get a benefit which may or may not be more than the cost of filing an amended return.
Now, there is a simple solution. Spade says he's asking lawmakers to take up another bill that would allow taxpayers who have already filed this year to take advantage of any changes that may yet still happen in next year's tax returns. The Senate is expected to take up conformity as early as tomorrow. From the newsroom, I'm Nick Reagan.